And welcome to all of you lovers of New York City, history, architecture, theater, literature. We are all gathered here today to honor and celebrate the life and the work of playwright Lorraine Hansberry at her one-time home. I'm Barbara Lee Diamondstein-Spielberg, the chair of the New York State Council on the Arts and the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center. Groups of dedicated individuals committed to informing the public about the past, present, and the future of historic preservation in our city. Our thanks to our collaborators in this, the Cultural Medallion for Lorraine Hansberry, our initial effort to bring more cultural medallions to Greenwich Village. Andrew Berman, on my left, is the Executive Director of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, and together with Harry Bubbins. Where is Harry Bubbins? Come join us, Harry. You've done most of the work here. Who is the Special Projects Director of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. To Jack Ziman, who owns this lovely building, and to all of you for joining us here today. Born on the south side of Chicago, the granddaughter of a freed slave and the youngest of 4 children, Lorraine Vivian Hansberry became the youngest playwright and the 5th woman and the first black writer to win the New York Drama Critics Circle Award for Best Play for A Raisin in the Sun, which opened nearly 60 years ago at the Ethel Barrymore Theater on March 11, 1959. Her father, Carl Augustus Hansberry, a successful real estate professional, founded one of the first banks for blacks in Chicago, the Lake Street Bank. Her mother was a teacher and ward committee woman, and her uncle was a scholar of African studies at Howard University. Nonetheless, Hansberry and her family were subject to racial discrimination, the most pervasive racial discrimination that took place not only then, but at last continues today. In 1937, the Hansberrys bought a house in Washington Park subdivision of Chicago, a white neighborhood, segregated through restrictive covenants. The Hansberrys were met with intense hostility by local residents and threatened by a white mob. A brick thrown through a window narrowly missed Lorraine, and she recalled her mother standing armed guard over the family on several occasions during this period. Physical threats were followed by a lawsuit in which the Supreme Court of Illinois upheld the legality of the restrictive covenant and forced the family to leave the house. It was not until 1940 that the United States Supreme Court reversed the lower court's ruling on a legal technicality. The result was the opening of 30 blocks of South Side Chicago to African Americans. Although the case did not determine that racially restrictive covenants were unlawful, it marked the beginning of their end. Lorraine Hansberry graduated from Englewood High School in Chicago, where she first became interested in theater. And rather than enrolling in one of the historically black colleges like our or Spelman, that traditionally attracted affluent and accomplished African American students, Hansberry enrolled in the University of Wisconsin at Madison. After 2 years, she left, before completing her degree to study painting in Chicago and Mexico. and then she moved to New York City in 1950 to begin her career as a writer who wrote for Paul Robeson's Freedom, a progressive publication, attended the nearby news school, and during a protest against racial discrimination at NYU, met Robert Nemiroff, a Jewish writer who shared her political views. On June 20th, 1953, they married at the Hansberry's home in Chicago. By 1956, she stopped working as a waitress and cashier and concentrated on her writing. The following year, she joined the Daughters of Bilitis and contributed letters to their magazine called The Ladder about feminism and homophobia. To preserve her anonymity, she wrote using the initials LHN. At the same time, she began work on A Raisin in the Sun, first calling it The Crystal Stair. In fact, she wrote the book not far from here on Bleecker Street. The Crystal Stair was taken from a line from the poem Mother to Son by Langston Hughes. She eventually settled on the title, A Raisin in the Sun, taken from the poem Harlem by Langston Hughes once again. In A Raisin in the Sun, Hansberry drew upon her own experience as well as the lives of working-class Black people who had rented from her father and who went to school with her on Chicago's South Side. Hansberry determined that there were indeed similarities between her family and the play's compelling character. In fact, she said in a 1960 interview, and I'm quoting, Beneatha is me 8 years ago. The sweeping impact of her work cannot be overstated. Writer James Baldwin said that A Raisin in the Sun, and I'm going to quote again, put more truth about Black people's lives on the stage than any other play in the entire history of theater. In 1961, Hansberry wrote the screenplay for the film adaptation, winning a Cannes Film Festival Award, and she was nominated for a Screenwriters Guild Award as well. She used some of the profits from Raisin to purchase this very house, 112 Waverly Place, in 1960. Soon afterward, she became involved with one of the building's tenants, Dorothy Secules. The two remained partners until Hansberry's premature death from cancer 5 years later. Although Hansberry and Nemiroff had divorced in 1962, he remained a champion of her work, adapting a collection of her writings and interviews into Be Young, Gifted, and Black, which opened off Broadway, again not very far from here, at the Cherry Lane Theater in 1968. As scholars and critics more closely examine Hansberry's lesser-known writings about feminism, lesbianism, and misogyny, it becomes clear that her unpublished essay in 1961 on homophobia and the intellectual impoverishment of women and a homosexual Bill of Rights, Hansberry herself wrote, "Men continue to misinterpret the second-rate status of women as implying a privileged status for themselves. Heterosexuals think the same way about homosexuals, Gentiles about Jews, whites about blacks, haves about have-nots." How these themes might have been addressed by her, we will never know. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 1964 and unfortunately died by the age of 34. It left a real void in the American theater. Tonight, this afternoon, it is our privilege to celebrate her life and her work. Before I introduce our distinguished speakers, I want to comment on the placement of cultural medallions. There are about 120 throughout all 5 boroughs. We have made requests for many, many, many more. But we do live in a country of private property rights, and the person who owns the building must give permission to have anything affixed to it. We wish more of those owners who are more collaborative. If you are among them, or friends, neighbors, or relatives, urge them and tell them how important this is. So what is we are honoring here? It is what Lorraine Hansberry was and what she accomplished. But as I pointed out, it can only be placed on properties whose owners grant permission for doing so. There are those who choose not to be involved in a program like this. You can do your part in helping persuade them to be more involved in so many ways. So, by the way, she wrote Raisin at 37 Bleecker Street, but made her home here. And selecting only one of the places where she lived does not minimize in any way her other accomplishments, but I'm sure you will understand that. So first I want to introduce Andrew Berman. You are very lucky to have him right in your neighborhood. I know of no neighborhood preservation organization that is as active. Certainly there are many that are as committed, but none as active and as imaginative as the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, of which Andrew is the executive director. He has been very active in securing landmark and neighborhood zoning protections. He was named to Vanity Fair's Hall of Fame. That's right. For his work to preserve Greenwich Village. He was named one of the 100 most influential New Yorkers by New York Magazine, and one of the 100 most powerful people. This one is really going to surprise you, in New York real estate by the New York Observer.
There you go.
With that, may I introduce my co-collaborator, Andrew Berman. I hope this is the beginning of a long and happy life with you. And this is an auspicious start. Andrew Berman, will you hold on to this while you're talking?
Thank you so much, Barbara Lee. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I see a lot of GVSHP members out there. GVSHP members, raise your hand. Thank you, as always, for supporting what we do. I want to thank, of course, the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center, our co-collaborator in this. As Barbara Lee pointed out, you know, this is the end of a very long line. It takes a lot to get here. A lot of work goes into this. A lot more than you might think just by looking or attending. I want to particularly acknowledge Harry Bubbins from our staff, who did so much to put this together and make it a possibility. And as Barbara Lee said, of course, the owner, Jack Zyman, and Mark Maynard, who's been incredibly helpful and collaborative in terms of making this happen. Mark, who works there. We at GVSHP work in many different ways to try to celebrate and document and protect the historic, architectural, and cultural legacy of Greenwich Village. Lorraine Hansberry really encapsulates so much about that. So much of what makes our neighborhood so rich and wonderful and impactful. And hopefully with this plaque today, we'll take things a step further in terms of ensuring that that memory is memorialized and that tradition continues. Lorraine Hansberry's friend, James Baldwin, has already been mentioned a couple of times. Another incredible resident of Greenwich Village who 2 years ago, we also placed a plaque on his home, and I think that both Lorraine Hansberry and James Baldwin and a lot of the people that we take time to celebrate really capture the marriage between the arts and activism that you see so pervasive in these communities. People who use the pen, the paintbrush, or a variety of different mediums, not just to create something that's beautiful, but impactful, and that will transform the way people live, the way people think, and the way our society functions. And certainly Lorraine Hansberry is the very embodiment of that, that dynamic. A Raisin in the Sun, for all of us who have seen it or read it or experienced it in some way, as you know, really not only affects people's hearts, but transforms their minds. And this was, of course, during a time period when there was a huge amount of conflict and change going on in America, and plays like A Raisin in the Sun really helped to shape that dialogue and move things forward in a way that we can only hope will continue in the present. Lorraine Hansberry was, of course, as was mentioned before, the first African-American woman to have a play performed on Broadway. She really was a trailblazer in so many ways. Her life was much too short, but it's amazing what she was able to accomplish in that time. She's obviously known for her works of writing, but if you dig a little deeper, you see these wonderful images of her standing in Washington Square Park, speaking at rallies on behalf of the NAACP, with whom she was very actively involved. As Barbara Lee mentioned as well, she was an early and somewhat furtively involved in the gay rights movement. She really dedicated her life to change and to transformation. You know, it was James Baldwin who actually said that that may have been part of her early undoing, because she bore such a burden in terms of carrying the weight on her shoulders of all that she was seeking to change and all that she was seeking to undo in terms of the injustice that she saw in the world. So hopefully today we carry that spirit forward a little bit further. The speakers today, I think, can even more illuminate how powerful that legacy and that history is. I want to again thank everybody for being here today, and after today, of course, we'll be able to pass by this plaque and be reminded of this, but hopefully for all of us it will spur us forward in terms of trying to continue the great work that has such a powerful tradition in this neighborhood, and obviously not just in this neighborhood, of transformation and positive change in our society. So thank you very much.
And thank you for your part in making it so. I should say, we never call it a plaque. It makes it sound like some orthodontic ailment. So we call it a cultural medallion and refer to it that way. And it's sort of more encompassing and less of an illness, really. But thank you for those important words. I think we should really, and I hope John Reddick later will be talking to the fact that she was inspired by Langston Hughes at that very same period. So was I. I can recite that whole poem. But first we are going to ask Mark Maynard, who was a resident of 112 Waverly Place, and he will represent the building's owner, Jack Ziman, who was a CEO at the Collective Works of Barrack. Am I saying that correctly? Can I just stand here? Do you think that?
I just wanted to thank everybody for coming this evening. Just from the heart, this is such a special evening, finding out that such an important person lived here. Sometimes they feel like icons. They didn't exist, but they did. They walked these streets. They communed here. They fellowshipped here with their friends. They're the creatives, and that legacy continues. So I feel blessed and honored, as I know everybody else does, to be able to live in this building and hopefully continue the legacy of Miss Lorraine Hansberry.
Thank you. Now Catherine Morris. Catherine Morris is the senior curator of the Elizabeth Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum. she was an independent curator, and then from, excuse me, from 2004 until 2009, adjunct curator of contemporary art for the Fulbright Art Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. How does that compare to our prairie in front of us? Among many exhibitions she has curated for the Sackler Center are the award-winning 6 Years by Lucy Lepard and the Emergence of Conceptual Art, and twice militant Lorraine Hansberry's Letters to the Latter. Please welcome Kathy.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read. Thank you, Barbara Lee, the New York State Council on the Arts, the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center, and the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation for inviting me to speak today to say a few words about the remarkable Lorraine Hansberry. As the senior curator of the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum, one of my jobs is to conceive of exhibitions that relate to the lives of the 1,038 women whose names appear on Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, a monumental work of art conceived to rewrite history, the history that many of us were taught. In 2013, as a part of my research, I began to look more closely at Lorraine Hansberry. In my experience, seemingly small pieces of information, passing references, often footnotes, in the life stories of famous individuals, open up unexpected and much larger stories that offer me, as a curator, the opportunity to speak in unexpected and expansive ways about a subject in the context both of the historical moment in which they lived and also to frame a conversation with current events which we ourselves are living through today. In the case of Lorraine Hansberry, a sentence, or was it a clause, in her Wikipedia entry jumped out at me. Since our exhibition in 2013, that entry has actually been expanded and rewritten, and today you can find the following paragraph under the heading Marriage in her Wikipedia entry. It reads, "It is widely believed that Hansberry was a closeted lesbian, a theory supported by her secret writings and letters and personal notebooks. She was an activist for gay rights and wrote about feminism and homophobia, joining the Daughters of Bilitis in contributing 2 letters to their magazine, The Ladder, in 1957, under the initials LHN. Personally, I would say that last sentence makes a much stronger point than the equivocal phrase widely believed would indicate. So, to be a bit more specific, building on her years of civil rights activism, in the late 1950s, Hansberry began to articulate her thoughts on the burgeoning gay rights and feminist movements through both public and private writings. Much of that work was done here in the West Village, where she lived alone after separating from her husband and ongoing collaborator, Robert Nemiroff. Working here, Hansberry produced the most compelling and frank work of her all too brief career. The energy and excitement in Hansberry's letters to the latter are palpable. In the magazine, she found a forum through which to participate in a community she very much saw herself a part of. The latter was the first nationally distributed, subscription-based lesbian publication in the United States. Founded in San Francisco, it was published monthly from 1956 to 1970, and then bi-monthly until 1972. In its early years, it flourished in spite of operating under the oppressive Comstock laws, which made illegal the distribution of so-called obscene materials through the United States Postal Service. The latter was the primary publication and method for communication for the Daughters of Bilitis, the first lesbian organization in the United States of which Hansberry became a member. By 1957, the magazine had 400 subscribers. So, among the lesser known of Hansberry's many gifts was the work she did to frame her own identity and articulate the interrelated social and political struggles of women, lesbians, and people of color. Hansberry's own lived experience drove a prescient and, by necessity in the late 1950s, largely underground examination of what we would today, thanks to Kimberly Crenshaw, call intersectionality. On feminism and her lesbian identity, Hansberry wrote in her first letter to the latter in May 1957, "I am more convinced than ever of the depth and sincerity and dignity you people are determined to pursue with your work. I cannot tell you how encouraging it is. It is time that half the human race had something to say about the nature of its existence. Otherwise, without revised basic thinking, the woman intellectual is likely to find herself trying to draw conclusions based on acceptance of a social moral superstructure which has never admitted to the equality of women and therefore is immoral itself. Here's another example from that first letter, this one addressing the struggle shared by people of color and the LGBTQ community on the questionable value of trying to assimilate into the dominant culture. Hansberry writes, as one raised in a subculture experience, I am a Negro, where those within were and are forever lecturing to their fellows about how to appear acceptable to the dominant social groups. I know something about the shallowness of such a view in and of itself. What ought to be clear is that one is oppressed or discriminated against because one is different, not wrong or bad. This is perhaps the bitters of the entire pill. I called my small exhibition Twice Militant, Lorraine Hansberry's Letters to the Latter. Taking the title from a 1959 interview Hansberry did with the oral historian and national radio personality Studs Terkel, in which she said, the most oppressed group of any oppressed group will be its women. And so, because they are twice oppressed, they are also likely to become twice militant. While the latter offered Hansberry a unique outlet for developing thoughts she couldn't express elsewhere, what comes through when reading Hansberry's letters, journals, and writings, all of which are housed in the New York Public Library Schomburg Center for Research on Black Culture, is a whole person. Hansberry was proud, hesitant, ambitious, frustrated, joyous, righteous, insecure, funny, and fierce. To make this point, we also included in the exhibition a copy of Hansberry's unpublished 1961 essay, just mentioned, on homophobia, the intellectual impoverishment of women, and a homosexual's Bill of Rights, in which she states, I have suspected for a good time that the homosexual in America would ultimately pay a price for the intellectual impoverishment of women. Men continue to misinterpret the second-rate status of women as implying a privileged status for themselves. Heterosexuals think the same thing about homosexuals, gentiles about Jews, whites about blacks, haves about have-nots. Finally, the other remarkable body of work we include in Twice Militant was examples of the notes and lists Hansberry made for herself throughout her life, often on her birthday. In these poetic texts, she typically juxtaposed lists of things she liked and didn't like about herself. For example, at age 30, she liked the insistent penetration of autumn sunlight, the fact that I have changed, have stayed the same, have grown more self-conscious and, at the same time, become less aware of myself. Mushrooms out of a can, the first drink of scotch, the second, the third. Under the heading of dislikes, she wrote, a goodly number of people, that fifth drink of scotch, the state of the world, critics, my own pomposity. And finally, in her own handwriting, with my highlights, a list titled, I am bored to death with, A Raisin in the Sun, Drinking Without Happiness, Eartha Kitt, Being a Lesbian, the capital L variety, Other People's Problems, The Race Problem, Silly White People, Rumors of War, The Great American Money Obsession, My Own Loneliness, all caps, Sex, Myself, Being a Celebrity, I Want, a short list, To Work, To Be in Love, Dorothy Sekulos. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now, John Reddick, historian and community scholar at Columbia University. He studied architecture at Yale University. He's worked with Robert Venturi's office, the Prospect Park Alliance, and later with Betsy Barlow Rogers and the Central Park Conservancy, where he worked extensively on Harlem public art projects, including the Frederick Douglass Circle and the Ralph Ellison Memorial. A longtime Harlem resident who refers to himself as Harlem Red. Have some competition there. He has also served on his community board and for many panels for art and transit, through which Dave Council on the Arts and the Percent for Art program of New York City. His recent scholarship explores the African American and Jewish influences on the American songbook. John Harlem Ray.
Well, first of all, architecture is exploring the city for me, and the city holds all these treasures. And I really feel like for Lorraine Hansberry, when she came to New York, if she had come at the early part of the 20th century, she would have lived in Harlem. All the opportunities that we associate with the village for African Americans coming from other places, Harlem was it. You could be bohemian, you could be rich and ostentatious, you could, all those things you felt you couldn't do in Georgia, you could come to New York and do it in Harlem. But in the post-war years, I think she was, as a writer and looking at American culture, saw integration and that next step, that post-war thinking, and the village would be where she would be. So I'm sure in Harlem they would have said, you know, she lives in the village. So they would be hinting at all the things we're referring to today, but the sense that there was some aspect of the sort of now day-to-day pedestrian culture of Harlem that might not support all that she wants to be. But she never let go of her connections with people like Baldwin, Langston Hughes, who in her coming to New York, she saw as real figureheads to the African American movement and its artistry. And her play, Raisin in the Sun, really references Langston Hughes' verse from Raisin in the Sun. So she loved him, she connected with him, and as she went forward, she started to see that the next generation was as important as the issues of her own generation. And in 1964, when Robert Kennedy and the Kennedy administration was facing the civil rights upheaval, Robert Kennedy brought together a group of noted African American figures to talk to him at the Justice Department. And in that meeting, there was Harry Belafonte, Baldwin, a whole range of civil rights players. And there was one young man there from the South who had really experienced what was going on in the South. And Bobby Kennedy was sort of saying, well, we're here for you. And in 40 years, he predicted he'd be an African-American president. He was on the money there. That wasn't fast enough for the people in the room. And even though he was talking about being an Irish immigrant and the struggles he had, there was some impatience to listen to that. And the young man from the Civil Rights Movement began to cry, saying that all that you said you're doing for us in the South, I stood there while your men waited till somebody was hit before they intervened. And the boy just kept crying, and the whole tenor of the room started to change. And Bobby Kennedy started searching out the room for what he thought were his peers that would listen, Baldwin and these other people. And Lorraine Hansberry looked at him and said, the most important person to listen to in this room is that young man. And the more anxious Kennedy got, she says, if you can't hear him, then you really can't hear the rest of us. And so when we think about that period, and then we think of someone as militant as Nina Simone, who went on to write the song Young, Gifted, and Black. Nina Simone goes on and on and on about how all her sense of the movement came from Lorraine Hansberry. And so when I passed this building, and you know those connections, you can imagine Nina Simone slipping in and out. And when Nina Simone wrote Young, Gifted, and Black, Lorraine Hansberry had passed. And she said she just woke up one day with this epiphany and vision of her friend, and she said she could literally see her. And so I can imagine her picturing her friend visiting this very house and saying the next generation had a voice that we had to listen to. And she penned these words, young, gifted, and black, we must begin to tell our young, there's a world waiting for you. This is a quest that's just begun. When you feel really low, yeah, there's a great truth that you should know. When you are young, gifted, and black, your soul's intact. So it worked for Nina, I think it worked for Lorraine, and I think it's a voice for all of us even today. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Tracy Heather Strain, is president and CEO of the Film Posse and an award-winning filmmaker, director, producer, writer, and consultant. A graduate of Wellesley College and the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Tracy serves as a professor of the practice in media and screen studies at Northeastern University. She's the director of the recently released, last week,
Toronto is the
very recently released, Sighted Eyes, Feeling Heart, a feature-length documentary about playwright Lorraine Hansberry, which had its world premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival, its U.S. premiere at the Chicago International Film Festival, and is slated for its New York opening on November 11th at the School of Visual Arts. And we congratulate you on that. It'll have its television premiere on the PBS series American Masters that just viewed Steven Spielberg. She's next on January 19th, 2018. Tracy Heatherstone.
Hi, thank you so much, Barbara Lee, for inviting me, and thank you to all the other organizations who made this possible. I have spent a lot of time in my life thinking of Lorraine Hansberry. It's been so much that if I bring up her name, my mom is like, la 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 la. The documentary that you've heard that I've completed has taken 14 years of my life. And one of the things I used to do before even the 14 years started is walk around the village, and I would go to 337 Bleecker Street, and I would come here to 112 Waverly Place because I knew, Lorraine Hansberry had lived here. And at that time, I didn't really know much about her at all. What I wanted to talk to you, since I did spend 14 years learning all about Lorraine Hansberry, I'll let you come to the film and hear a lot more about her. But today I thought I'd just kind of focus on Waverly Place, because in fact we don't talk about Waverly Place in the documentary.
Any reason for that?
She was, we weren't, the way we told the story, we decided to not talk about her as a lesbian until after she moves to Croton. Am I making this happen? First of all, I don't know if anyone was going to talk about this, but this building was built in 1826. We love history. That's why I make these films. I love history. It was built in 1826. It was updated in 1916 by architect Adolf Nast. And Lorraine Hansberry moved here, as you have already heard, at the end of 1959 and the beginning of 1960 with her proceeds from probably the movie and the play. She sold 112 Waverly Place in June of 1964. And I wanted to read you some of the things I looked through her papers, because I've gone through a lot of her papers, and wanted to see when 112 Waverly Place came up, and so I wanted to read you a few things. So this letter is from Dorothy Sekulis to Lorraine Hansberry, circa 1961. No, let me back up. Lorraine Hansberry bought this place, and Dorothy Sekulis, who became her on-again, off-again partner, was already living here. Dorothy was 15 years Lorraine's senior, and I guess over time they fell in love. Another person who was important in Lorraine Hansberry's life was Bert DeLugoff. His brother ran the village gate, and Bert was involved sometimes, but he was going to medical school and eventually became a physician, but he lived here as well. So she bought the place, and she says, here's what she wrote in 1961. This is actually from Dorothy to Lorraine. No news of 112. Everything has been quiet and uneventful. Did notice that a gentleman is living in the basement. Can't tell whether it's the old one or the new one. We'll investigate further. Then Lorraine wrote to a lawyer in 1961. Greetings. Here are some goodies. All is quiet at 112. I shall wish to have a meeting of the board sometime at everyone's convenience. That is you, Bob, that's Bob Nemiroff, Clarence, that's Clarence, oh my gosh, Clarence, I'm totally blanking on his name. He's in our documentary. He's a lawyer. He was a lawyer for James Baldwin and Martin Luther King, and sometimes he was her lawyer, and me. I should like very much when it's possible to hear a complete accounting of how things presently stand with all my affairs, contractually, house, taxes, money, the works. March 1964, Hansberry Diary. Business. Think there's a buyer for home, 112. Only wants to pay $10,000 down or something though. $8,000 sale, however. May 15th, 1964. As for good news, there is some change. There appears to be a buyer for 112. I can hardly believe it, 3 exclamation points. But they've signed papers today and there's a check and all, and I'm beside myself with happiness over it. May 29th, 1964, from her diary. Money. Been lying here worrying about it. Want D, Dorothy, to get a nicer apartment, for which I shall share the rent. True that 112 is being sold, but I plan not to touch that. June 6th, 1964, from her diary. Sold 112. So one of the challenges of making a documentary about Lorraine Hansberry is like going through all of these papers and all of these things she's writing about, all sorts of topics, and deciding, what to put in the film. And so, as I said, 112 Waverly Place is not in our documentary. We focus on 337 Bleecker Street, and we focus on the village. There's a really lovely scene that I hope all of you people from the village will love, because we talk about how important that was to her development as a writer and a source of inspiration. Lorraine Hansberry, as you've heard already, is so complicated. There's so many ways we could have told her story, and we chose to focus on a story that of her as an artist and an activist, and we feel like that as the first feature documentary about Lorraine Hansberry, where we've learned that people have forgotten who she was. We thought that was the story to tell, and it turns out, because of when we're getting done, it's a really timely story to tell, and so we're just so pleased to be able to bring it to audiences. The responses have been really well. I'd love to see you at our screening at Doc NYC on the 11th, and you can let me know what you think. I would be really honored to hear from you all. So thank you for letting me speak here today, and I know more about Lorraine Hansberry than a lot of things. So if you have other questions about her after this event, please don't hesitate to ask me. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy Strain. Now it is a real pleasure to introduce the award-winning writer, producer, and media consultant, so I'm very familiar to all of you. Now the host of CUNY Television's Black America. Carol Jenkins is a well-known reporter, writer, and speaker. During her Emmy Award-winning career, she anchored WNBC TV's evening newscast, covered international, national, and local politics, and hosted on WNYW her own daily talk show, Carol Jenkins Live. She was the founding president of the Women's Media Center, which bestows the Carol Jenkins Young Journalist Award to an accomplished media professional each year. She is also the chair of the Leadership Council of the African Medical and Research Foundation, a 55-year-old Nairobi-based organization and the largest African-American health NGO on the continent. She's the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement in International Reporting Awards from the National Association of Black Journalists, and holds honorary degrees from Marymount Manhattan College and the College of New Rochelle. I bring you Carol Jenkins, very live.
Thank you, Barbara Lee, for everything that you do. I've been sitting in some of your meetings as you rescue and give respect to places in the city. As Barbara Lee said, I host a program called Black America, conversations with Black people who ordinarily would not get a half an hour to tell their story and to document their contributions to our lives. And I just recently came from Birmingham, where my uncle's motel, the A.G. Gaston Motel, which was the headquarters for Martin Luther King when they were desegregating Birmingham, was just made a part of the Birmingham Monument.
Play takes place in that.
Pardon me?
Play takes place.
Exactly. So, and Lorraine talks a lot about Birmingham. It was a part of her psyche, what happened. We just did a documentary called "The Conscience of America," because what happened in the streets and as the homes got blown up in Birmingham really awakened our country to the plight of Black Americans and of racial discrimination. So for me, having Lorraine Hansberry's home medallioned, given this honor is just so extraordinary. It means that now when people walk by, they will know that someone very important was here. I must say, though, it's an example of yet another real estate deal that escaped me because I guess it was $80,000, darn. But Lorraine had it and sold it and, did much with her life. I've been listening to the recordings of Lorraine Hansberry. You can get them. They're on CD and I guess online too. It is so incredible, the clarity of her voice, the eloquence in her voice. This was a brilliant, brilliant woman. I'm going to read for just a little bit here. What is very clear is that Lorraine Hansberry was a genius, prescient, and eloquent on the shortcomings of our country in the 1950s and 60s. We really, really need her now. On race, on LGBTQ issues, on war. This is what she said: no to war of any kind, anywhere. Get rid of the little bombs and the big ones. And she was a true feminist. Back then she said, I think it is about time that equipped women begin to take on some of the ethical questions which a male-dominated culture has produced and dissected and analyzed them quite to pieces. I love that way of describing it. Dissect them quite to pieces. In a serious fashion, it is time that half the human race had something to say about the nature of its existence. Otherwise, without revised basic thinking, the woman intellectual is likely to find herself trying to draw conclusions, moral conclusions, based on acceptance of a social moral superstructure which is never admitted to the equality of women and is therefore immoral itself. And as we fight for the Equal Rights Amendment, and as we keep saying "Me Too" on our Instagram and Facebook accounts for sexual advances and aggression, we need Lorraine Hansberry today. As a journalist, one of the things that I love about Lorraine Hansberry was that she was a journalist. In the 1950s, her time working for the Paul Robeson published Freedom magazine. She was advised by the giant thinker W.E.B. Du Bois. Her interest in the subjugation of African countries and her vision then of their independence, the end of colonial rule, of inequality of blacks in this country, and what it would take to fix things in America. She refused to divide the black people of America and talk about activism. At Birmingham, when the protests were going on and she got invited to the White House to talk with Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and he kept trying to divide, the sort of the well-educated blacks to the people who were protesting in the South. She said, "We are not remotely interested in coming to the White House for a tea. We are one people represented by the Negroes in the streets of Birmingham." I love her approach to one's work. The question is not whether one will make a social statement in one's work, she said, but only what the statement will say. For if it says anything at all, it will be social. James Baldwin has summed up Raisin in the Sun. Never before in the entire history of the American theater had so much of the truth of black people's lives been seen on the stage, as Barbara Lee told us. And I was recently reading a remembrance by Douglas Turner Ward, who was one of the founders of the Negro Ensemble Company. Village people remember those days. Incredible. Who was also a journalist in his early life. And he came to a reading of his friend's play. It must have been on Bleecker Street because she was trying to get him a role in A Raisin in the Sun. He described her then as one with steel will and a brilliant intellect, and that the creation of Walter Lee changed America. What Douglas Turner Ward says is that it is Walter Lee, flawed, contradictory, irascible, impulsive, furious, and most of all desperate, who emerges as the most unique creation of his time and of ours. Walter Lee is a prophetic omen. His combustion was soon to erupt into American reality with a vengeance. No matter what we've experienced, the Walter Lees have not been reckoned with, and don't we know it until this very day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol Jenkins, and thanks to all of you. You know, I'm standing here feeling like John Kennedy in Berlin. Ich bin ein village person too. So it has really been an honor to dedicate this cultural medallion with these really fine speakers, community activists, all of you standing here and shivering as I am. Thank you for your patience and your interest. Will Deborah Burchard and Harry Bubbins please come forward to unveil and read the cultural medallion. Harry, will you unveil it? Okay. And Deborah Burchard will read it while he's doing that. And you should come up too, Simeon, the father of all historic districts. If there's anyone that any of you would like to recommend for a cultural medallion, please be in touch with HLPC. You can find it online at www.hlpcculturalmedallions.org. And to remind you, this video will be made available to everyone because it will be on the video archives of Duke University. And if you just type in the name and my name, it will come up. And you can see yourself as the audience as well. So at least you pan a great shot before they leave. Thanks to each and all of you for joining us here today, for celebrating the life of Lorraine Hansberry. Our next medallion will be in Greenwich Village as well, but we're not ready to announce it yet. Thank you. Deborah?
Lorraine Vivian Hansberry, May 19, 1930 to January 12, 1965. The first African-American woman to write a play performed on Broadway, Lorraine Hansberry is best known for A Raisin in the Sun, about a Chicago family living under racial segregation. The play's title is drawn from Langston Hughes' poem, Harlem, and some of its elements are taken from her parents' life. Their purchase of a home in a racially restricted Chicago neighborhood eventually culminated in a 1940 Supreme Court decision that restrictive covenants could be legally contested. In 1950, Hansberry moved to New York City, where she attended the New School, wrote for Paul Robeson's Pan-Africanist newspaper Freedom, and in 1953 married producer Robert Nimiroff. Later involved with the nation's first lesbian rights organization, the Daughters of Bilitis, Hansberry bought this building in 1960, where she resided until her death. Hansberry inspired Nina Simone's 1969 song, "To be Young, Gifted, and Black."